My name is Mike Kensler. I'm the director of the Sustainability Office here at Auburn University, and it's our pleasure to welcome you tonight to this National Power Dialog. Let me quickly run through the evening for you. We're going to start with an introductory video by Eben Goodstein at Bard College, who came up with this idea. And then you'll hear from the three panelists you see on the screen with me here. Daniel Tait, the CEO of Energy Alabama. Want to wave to everybody, Daniel? Reverend Malcom, who's the president of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, and Dr. Karen McNeal, who's associate professor in the College of Science and Mathematics, who's an expert in climate science, communication, and education. When each one's done speaking, I'll ask them one question, and then the next panelist will present, and at the end, you'll have the opportunity to ask your own questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. If you click on that, you can type your question in there. And if you see a question you like, you can hit the thumbs up icon and it will move to the top of the questions that get asked. As we approach 7:30, our panelists will each have a couple minutes to summarize what they had to say and their takeaway message for you. And you should know that this webinar is being recorded, and will be available on our website in the next day or two. That's auburn.edu/sustainability. So without further ado, let's see this video from Eben Goodstein.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 US states, Puerto Rico, DC, and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact, the US state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the US. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments, starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently, the Chinese and Indians. Government policies have brought these industries to scale, and now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
Well, what can we do here in Alabama? To kick us off, we're going to hear from Daniel Tait with Energy Alabama.
Hello, everyone. As Mike said, my name is Daniel Tait. I'm with Energy Alabama, and we are a nonprofit organization that is working to accelerate the transition to sustainable energy here in the state. We work on education and advocacy and a little bit of technical assistance. So trying to help folks and nonprofits and businesses actually make this transition. I wanted to spend some time with y'all today talking about, as you heard the professor earlier talk a little bit about the main policies and issues that are affecting the country, and why he mentioned how Georgia had jumped into the top 10. We're going to talk a little bit about that and some of the issues that are facing Alabama and how we can also make the same jump as Georgia. As he mentioned before, we have quite a few policies and regulations here in the state of Alabama that frankly hinder the growth of things like renewable energy and electric transportation. And so we need to get some things out of the way, and then we need to put some good things in its place. And one of those things is called third-party ownership. And so I love to show this picture, and I know Reverend Malcom loves this picture as well. And he's going to hopefully be able to talk about that a little bit as well. But the reason that I do this is because third-party ownership at its core is a policy that allows, as you heard the professor before, when you get government to help kind of create a market, you got to then let the market do what the market is best at. And so third-party ownership, frankly, allows you as an individual. It could allow a company or a church or a nonprofit or a government agency like a university or like a city or a county to buy energy from someone other than their current utility provider. So for most of the folks in the state, they have an electric utility provider. Maybe that's Alabama Power, maybe that's TVA through a local power company like Huntsville Utility, or maybe it is an electric cooperative like Central Alabama Electric Cooperative. And so third-party ownership actually says, well, for a portion of your demand or for the portion of energy that you would like, you can actually buy from someone else who might be able to provide a better, cleaner, and or cheaper product. And so the main reason that I show a picture like this is because one of the biggest beneficiaries of a policy like third-party ownership that we've seen in other states are nonprofit organizations, their churches, their schools, their local governments, because as many folks know, there are tax credits and tax benefits to investing in things like solar energy. But if you're a nonprofit organization or you're a church, you can't take advantage of those and pass those benefits along. And so you need a good policy at the state level to be able to allow your church, your congregation, your city to take advantage of that type of a policy. So third-party ownership is really important. It helps to create competition. It helps to level the playing field so that you as a consumer or you as a business actually have options. But we're only solving part of the problem here. This is partly an access problem, right? Once we have more access to the market and more people can actually get into this transition, we need to solve a second problem. If you would like to take action, I hope that you'll join us as well. This is a new campaign that we had, along with some others, have kicked off called Energy Freedom Alabama, and that can be visited at energyfreedomalabama.com, where you can learn about third-party ownership, also often referred to as energy freedom, and how you can take action with the legislature to help make this happen. So once we talk a little bit about the access issue, then the second issue that comes to bear is one of compensation, well, one of payment, if you will. So if people can have access to a market, or businesses and nonprofits and churches can have access to a market, but if they're not fairly compensated for the value that they're bringing to the grid, if they're not fairly compensated for the value that they're bringing to their homes or to their small businesses, then the access is frankly not worth a lot. It's just all talk and no real action. And so we have quite a few issues with that here in the state of Alabama, right? And so you can see by a couple of news articles that I've displayed here is that one is that Alabama Power, as many of you probably know, has a $5 per kW per month tax on grid-connected solar at the small scale. So this is really targeted to affect the profitability of homes and businesses that attempt to go solar. And so you say, well, Daniel, I don't understand what all these KWs and all that stuff means. Tell me what it means in real dollars. And so the Alabama Power solar tax is about half of the money that you could expect to make from your solar array is just taxed right off the top. Obviously, this affects the economic position of your decision. And as a consequence, Alabama is much further behind than our neighbor, Georgia. And so there's a few organizations that are working hard to try to overturn this tax. TVA has not introduced a tax per se, but has taken pretty aggressive steps to cut many of its renewable energy programs and the compensation that it offers to consumers and small businesses as well. And so you look at the electric utilities in the state of Alabama and the regulatory structure, if you will, from the Public Service Commission to oftentimes the legislature itself, not providing guidance or not helping to set good policy. What you find is utilities that are looking to entrench their monopoly and not take action on these issues, as opposed to provide fair evaluation to allow folks like you and me, or small businesses and churches and nonprofits, to actually take good advantage of these types of things. So we want to solve partly an access issue with third-party ownership, and then we also want to solve evaluation, make sure that the people who do now get access to the market are fairly compensated. And the third thing I'd like to talk to you about is around electric vehicles, electric transportation, and related infrastructure. As you heard the professor before, this is extremely important, especially in Alabama. If you look at where emissions come from in the state of Alabama, a large portion, depending on where you live, if not the largest portion, comes from transportation, right? This state in many areas builds out as opposed to building up. And so we have a lot of people that are really tied to their cars to be able to get to and from work. And so as a consequence, we also spend a substantial amount of our income on transportation. And as many folks know, VW got caught in a diesel cheating scandal, and as a consequence had to, basically pay a fine and put a lot of money into electric vehicle infrastructure, of which, the state of Alabama is able to get a substantial portion of that as well. And there are things that we can do by making sure that our cities, so, contact your city, contact your county, your university, making sure that they're going after this money from VW and looking at electric transportation, whether that be electric buses on a campus or at a city level, or helping to make sure that this infrastructure is built out at public locations throughout the state. And there are also things that your electric utility can do, right? Because your electric utility, whether it be the rate structure, helping to incentivize you to charge at the best times for the grid, or the cleanest times for the grid, they can provide incentives, they can provide rate structures that allow more and more people to take full advantage of electric transportation. And it can be good for you and be good for the electric utility because they're able to sell more power. And when we're selling more power, we're hoping that the utilities are also going to be investing in renewables, or that you might be doing that through third-party ownership and fair valuation to help offset your increased electric demand on the system. And that is the top three things that I think that you want to know about with energy policy: third-party ownership, helping to get access, fair valuation, helping to get fair compensation, and helping to make sure that we can build out our infrastructure and take advantage of clean transportation.
Thank you, Daniel. One question I have for you: you mentioned Georgia is so much better than Alabama at this. What's the difference? How have they been able to jump into a top 10 state where Alabama is really at the bottom in terms of ranking for solar energy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, if you look at Georgia and Alabama, you would think, what's the difference? They're very similar states in the sense that they're very politically conservative, and they both have Southern Company subsidiaries in Georgia, Georgia Power. They both have TVA operating territories. They both have a lot of electric cooperatives. Frankly, the difference has been political leadership. And if you look at, in the case of Georgia, this is not to say that Georgia is the most perfect example, but just to draw a pretty stark comparison, you have a public service commission in Georgia that is made up of 5 members compared to the 3 and that we have here in Alabama. Again, those are, just like Alabama, all elected Republicans. However, they have, taken aggressive steps. They have not introduced subsidies or any type of necessarily an incentive for renewables, but just helping to create a level playing field at the regulatory level at the Public Service Commission, and kind of forcing the utilities to say, hey, you've got to go out for bid. You've got to look at this stuff. And if it makes cost-effective sense for customers, you got to go buy it. We haven't had that type of political leadership in the state of Alabama to kind of start to force that issue and make the utilities take the economic step. So I think it's political leadership. And once that started to happen, you started to see policies, not just at the Public Service Commission, but also at the state legislature. They passed third-party ownership in 2015 or 2016. Not exactly sure of the year there, but 2015 or 2016, and you see this massive explosion in development there. So, they just took a couple of base hits. They made a couple of small steps to help level the playing field, and boom, we can get around the bases. So, I think that we can do the same here.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a great segue to Reverend Michael Malcom, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the Public Service Commission and environmental justice. So, Reverend Malcom.
Thank you, Michael. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with you all. I would like to thank Michael Kinsler, Auburn University, and the Office of Sustainability for this invite. Although I'm a Black preacher and brought up in the Black church, I assure you that I will not be before you long. I'm Reverend Michael Malcom. I am the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Alabama IPL is a program of the People's Justice Council, of which I am the founder and Executive Director. Alabama IPL is a statewide faith-based organization. Our work centers around energy democracy and environmental justice. And today's context is actually calling for both. While reading the introduction of a book entitled Energy Democracy, Advancing Equity and Clean Energy Solutions, I ran across these words by Denise Fairchild and Al Weinrub. And I quote, "A global energy war is underway. It is being waged on numerous fronts with distinct battle lines. It's man versus nature, global north versus global south, fossil fuel versus clean energy, globalization versus local sovereignty, the powerful moneyed class versus low income and indigenous communities and communities of color, the haves versus the have-nots, and fundamentally, an extractive economy versus a regenerative economy, end quote. Now, that was before COVID-19. Now we must add in this X factor of a virus. Coronavirus has exposed our defenses and shattered the self-image of America. It has exposed our defenses in that we now see how weak we truly are in disaster preparedness. It has shattered our self-image because it is laid bare for everyone to see that we have a severe system of inequity. We have an extractive economy that continues to allow utilities to bill customers while they are locked down in their homes to avoid health disruptions. The last thing that people need is to not only have to worry about their health disruptions, but to also have to worry about service disruptions. Yet we have a state that has yet to mandate no shutoffs. No shutoffs for that single mother that was trying to make life work on an already strained budget due to her low pay and service industry job. No shutoffs for that grandmother that has to choose whether the price of her medicine has to choose between, the price of her medicine versus keeping power in the house. No shutoffs for those houses of worship that were established to serve our communities, and now their intake is down to almost nothing because they can't even open their buildings to encourage people during this difficult time. The coronavirus demands energy democracy. Energy democracy contributes to regenerative economy. In essence, we need to own our own energy. In every household, if every household had access to affordable solar, the people and the planet would benefit. At present, there's a solar tax being charged to price out our access to solar. There's very little mention of alternative, less harmful energy coming from our government leadership. In particular, our Public Service Commission has been more interested in protecting profit than protecting people, the people that they vowed to serve. As I close, I'd like to leave you with not just hope, but also courage. The coronavirus has attacked some of our families, our incomes, relationships, and even some of our bodies. It has also attacked the oppressive systems that keep us from having a voice at decision-making tables. This is to our advantage, and we must act now. We need to let our commissioners know that we need energy democracy, and we need it now. The coronavirus is demanding energy democracy, and so should we. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Malcom. One question I have for you is, with all the solutions that Daniel suggested, and you rightly point at this Public Service Commission as a leverage point, in implementing these new solutions, how do we ensure that the folks you're talking about, the underserved, that their needs are met, that it's an all-inclusive solution and doesn't just address those with the loudest voices?
Again, we have got to make these alternative energy, such as solar, affordable to all. We've got to make access to these energy sources accessible to all. And that is the only way that we'll be able to deal with the people that we often overlook and underserve. we've got to put them first.
Thank you. Karen McNeal, would you like to talk to us about climate communications?
Yes, here I am. Just getting my slides going here. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm already so inspired by what I've heard from Daniel and Reverend Malcom. Today, I'm going to wrap us up with just talking a little bit about climate change communication. I'm an associate professor, as Mike mentioned, at Auburn University. And one of the things I do is I research climate change and how people think about climate change and how to communicate about it. So I'm excited to talk to you tonight. So earlier, you did this activity where you use your computer or your phone to respond to where you were from. And so now I want you to do that same activity, but answer this question of typing a word that describes how you feel about communicating climate change to others. You know, just an emotion or something that you maybe think about when you get asked or faced with the task of communicating climate change to others. And I'll give everybody a few moments. Overwhelming, exhausted, apprehensive, sure, I can relate to that. Confrontational, necessary, important. Yeah. Excited, some people are excited. Let's see, frustrating, unbelieved, apprehensive, motivating. So we have I'll let these keep rolling in, but you know, there's this mixed modality of, oh, it's really important, something I should do, but I'm kind of nervous, scared, exhausted, don't want to confront people, don't want to get in an argument. I mean, there's all these feelings we have when nervous, very big words there, when we are faced with the thought of communicating climate change. And yet some people are hopeful. Yes, so we have kind of this dual modality, and probably you're here because you think it's important. I'm going to move, I've got one more for you before we get started with the PowerPoint content that I want to deliver. So type a word that describes a barrier. So not just an emotion, but a barrier when you're going to talk to somebody. What's politics? Yes. Education, partisanship, news, ideology, Fox, yes, exactly. Jargon. I saw the word wicked, probably because it's a wicked problem. Yeah, we're getting a lot of capitalism. Fixed mental models. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I don't have a lot of time. People who are stubborn. But we are going to pick up on some of these ideas in the PowerPoint. So I'm glad that you're already thinking. But politics is central here, we see, and especially in Alabama. And so what I'm going to talk to you about, and one of the things I'd like you to remember, is that as people learn and they think and make decisions about anything, but especially climate change, we're kind of talking to the two parts of our brain, the part that processes cognitive information or operates cognitively, and the part that is emotional, or what we call the affective domain. And when we think about these two processing systems, so the one on the left, analytical, or what I labeled earlier as the cognitive domain, or the one, this table to the right, that's about the experiential or emotional or affective domain, we can look at these attributes for each of these processing systems. And if we look towards the left, it's logical, it's deliberative, it's very analytical. We look at reality and we can use symbols, words, and numbers to interpret our reality. We have rules that we abide by, and we have things that we have to learn in order to understand those rules, but we can be very systematic. And oftentimes scientists will show tables, figures, and graphs and charts, and we will use these to be systematic in our analysis. That doesn't mean we don't also have the things on the right of the table, the experiential processing system, that is more intuitive. You don't have to know a bunch of rules. It's emotion. It's part of our DNA. It's the way we might respond to really any threat, and it operates automatically. And one of the examples of information we might process is people's stories. We might see imagery. We might use our past experience to make decisions. But the idea is that this part of our brain is very emotionally charged, and that it doesn't operate like the analytical processing system that we have. And so let's talk about the first one, the cognitive or the analytical system. And when we think about climate change, boy, there's a lot to know and understand and process from a climate science perspective. I'm showing you two figures here, one that's showing a conceptual model of the greenhouse effect, and the other one on the right that's showing the carbon cycle and various Earth systems. And, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Boy, you have to really know a lot when it comes to climate science and understand the system interactions, the feedback, how matter and energy is transferred, what are the feedbacks, what is the climate dynamics, how does the Earth radiative forces work? You know, there's certainly a lot, and it can take semesters to understand, of college courses, to really truly understand this system, and it can be quite overwhelming. And on top of that, there's a lot of misconceptions that people might have. For example, I have seen a misconception between the ozone layer and the greenhouse effect. That is a very common misconception, that the ozone layer has something to do, and the hole in the ozone layer specifically has something to do with the greenhouse effect. That's quite prevalent. Now, if we move on and we talk about the emotional or affective challenges that we have, I'm going to show you this example from a publication. This is, I want you to focus on the graph to the left. This is Kahan et al. From Yale. They came up with a really well-known publication in 2012. And basically to the left, I have Democrats and Republican in quotations because the study was actually way broader than that. It included cultural worldview, egalitarians, and hierarchical individualists. But I labeled them because these are terms that we know. And so if we look at what one might expect on the graph to the left, as people become more scientifically knowledgeable, we would expect that their interpretation of risk, especially around climate change, would go up, whether they're Republican or Democrat. It shouldn't matter. Unfortunately, the graph to the right is what the data show, in that we see that upward trend of increased risk perception with increases in scientific and numeracy comprehension with Democrats, but with Republicans, we see the opposite trend occur. In fact, those that know more and have more knowledge about science and numeracy tend to perceive the risk of climate change to be lower. And this is an interesting phenomenon that occurs. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And some of you brought this up in your responses earlier. But some of them is because of the trusted sources, the leaders of those various trusted communities and the types of responses they have. Some of it is due to misinformation campaigns that are alive and well. Some of it is because of confirmation biases, where people try to find information that might support the emotional part of what they think, but not necessarily the analytical. Some of it is due to cognitive dissonance, where there's different values that are conflicting with knowledge that is being brought in. And of course, many of you hit it in the head, it's due to politics. And so when we think about the human mind, there's a lot of complexity that happens, and a lot of, you know, tug and pull a little bit of things that we have to consider, especially when we're communicating about climate change, that people are going to rely on that isn't necessarily completely analytical, and that our judgment and our behavior making and decision making can be really affected by our affect, our values, and our worldviews, and our own personal experiences. And our mental models tend to be fairly simplistic when it comes to understanding of the climate science system. And so how do we overcome this? I mean, there's just a lot here that I just laid out in the short couple of minutes, a lot of challenges. Well, effective communication is really an important key. And I'm going to lay out in the next few moments that I have just 5 key strategies that you should maybe consider, if you may already be doing this, when you think about communicating climate change to to a various audience. The first thing and the most important thing is to know your audience. You have to know what their value system is, because we know that that is a very important influencer for how people think about climate change. Here's an example of how you can do that, depending upon your audience. Let's say your audience is a room full of Alabamians. Here's a website that is available, freely available. The Yale Climate Change Communication Project has gone through and done numerous surveys across the country. And we can use this information, it's at our fingertips on the web, to give us an idea at the county level for Alabama on what various counties perceive when it comes to climate change and global warming. This particular question was about whether the respondents believed global warming is happening. In Lee County, Alabama, 63% of the citizens in that county agree with that statement that global warming is happening, which is 5% higher than the entire state of Alabama and somewhat lower than the average for the entire country. We can look at the number of adults who are worried about global warming, and we have over 50% in Lee County, Alabama, and in the state of Alabama who are worried. We can look at what kind of agreement there is with regulating CO2 as a pollutant, and it's quite high. It's nearly 70% for both Lee County, the state, and is on par with the rest of the country. However, when we look at the item that asked about whether the respondent discussed global warming, at least occasionally with anyone else, we see that for the county, the state, and the country, this factor is quite low. This is why I'm excited about the fact that we're doing this tonight to promote dialogue that is happening, that should be happening across the country. And so this is one resource that you might could use for learning about your demographic that you're planning to talk to. I would encourage, of course, if you know more about who you're presenting to, if it's a more specific group, and I'll give an example later, there are other ways you can find out and speak to what they might value. So, and one way to do this is to get your audience attention. Again, those values are important so that you can frame the climate change issue around those values. And that will help it resonate with the community you want to reach. And so, for instance, framing is a communication tool. It's a way to message an idea. So here are some examples from the CREED guide. It's pictured here in the middle, the Psychology of Climate Change Communication. And here are 3 examples they use. You could use a local frame. A lot of people care about their local communities. So why not talk about how climate change is going to affect them at the local level? Now versus future change frame. A lot of people talk about climate change happening in the far future, but in fact, it's happening now. And people respond to the now more than they do, 50 years from now. Well, I don't need to worry about that. That's a long time. And then lastly, example is the human health frame. Putting it in regard to how it's going to affect your health, your children's health, etc., is an important frame that resonates with a lot of people. And I just wanted to give a more concrete example. So I Googled the Garden Club of Alabama. I don't really know anybody in the Garden Club of Alabama, but I know them as a organization. And I just Googled on their page. If I were to go talk to the Garden Club of Alabama, I would have done a little research about them. And from their own homepage, from the president of this organization, they have a quote, a biblical quote from Genesis 2:15 that talks about why their organization is important. And it talks about the Garden of Eden. And it goes on to talk about the fact that to plant a garden is a belief in tomorrow, that there's something good to come from tomorrow. And so if I were to talk to this group as a Christian, of course, too, I would say I would take a biblical frame and talk about how climate change is right in line in caring for God's creation. I may also talk about a future frame because this group seems very passionate about having an earth, a garden that is there for their future generations. So that's an example. The third strategy is talking about the real world and not just talking about abstract information. And here's a little comic that might help describe that. Of course, the scientist here not doing a very good job of answering a very simple question, which is to tell the time for this grandma here. But of course, not being effective. And there's all kinds of resources that we can bring and look for that I've used for effectively communicating about climate change. I've already mentioned the psychology of climate change communication. I'm also drawing on for this presentation the handbook from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. There's several other resources that I would suggest that are great resources for starting to think about how to talk about this issue. And some of the strategies I've listed here are from these resources. The idea of using metaphors and analogies. So you've probably heard the heat trapping blanket analogy used to describe greenhouse gas and the greenhouse effect. You might have heard the term loaded dice, which is the idea that climate change is stacking the odds for extreme weather to happen more frequently. You might have heard about the bathtub effect, which really is talking about stocks and flows of CO2 in the atmosphere. You might have even heard people refer to our planet as sick, and using that as an example of why you should be listening to scientists, because you would listen to your doctor if you were diagnosed with cancer. And other things to consider is think about yourself and your personal experiences with climate change. When I first started researching climate change as an undergraduate, our atmospheric CO2 concentration was 367 parts per million. It is now 410. I'm not that old, I don't think. Also, to be human is really important. So one person that does that really well, if you happen to see Catherine Hayhoe when she was here a couple of months ago and she came by Auburn and Birmingham, she's a climate scientist, but she connects her evangelical faith with what she does as a climate scientist, and she does it really well. Now, not all of us are that skilled, but still bringing that human side is so important. And then this little figure that I have to the left is basically telling us, for those of us who come from a scientific background, that we need to get to the bottom line first, and don't wait to the end to get to the bottom line, because you've already lost your audience at that point. And the fourth out of 5 is to use effective imagery. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, except that there's a ton of resources to find effective images. This one is climatevisuals.org. And it's showing the impacts of climate change. Obviously, 3 of these pictures are actually in the United States. And the one to the top right is from an Asian country. However, these pictures, the climatevisuals.orgs have climate impacts all around the globe. And it just, and they can be used to communicate about climate change. And lastly, I would say, is to be hopeful and solutions oriented. So often we get left with those pictures of dread and drear, but we don't think about what we can do as an individual and as a collective, and give people, empower people. I mean, it's really important that we don't leave people kind of stuck thinking, oh, well, the world's ending and there's nothing I can do anyway, so why should I care? So I would say that this is quite important, because there's tons of reasons to be hopeful. You can Google climate hope on the internet and find these images, along with many, many others. And there's so much that's happening, especially within the last 5 or 10 years, that we can be hopeful about. We have a lot of work to do, but we can still be hopeful. And so the last thing that I'm going to leave you with, maybe you're already doing something, but if you can respond and participate with me one more time about a communication strategy that you might have just heard, or that you already use in talking with others about climate change. Real world, I think. Connection, patience, that's a good one. Know your audience, metaphors, imagery, good. Health, frame, jobs, common ground, yeah. Those are great. Faith, passion. Yeah, these are great. Great job, you guys. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me. I know it's a little on the long side, but I just want to leave you with, let's talk about climate, and you have 5 strategies to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. One question for you is, there's a lot of information, misinformation out there. Are there some websites that you really like that you could point people to? Because, the information is constantly changing. The political fraudulent statements are constantly being created. So what about some good websites?
Yeah, I really like the Skeptical Scientist website. If you're familiar with that, they have different levels of responses for different questions people might have about the science of climate change. And it has like a basic, intermediate, and an advanced level. And it kind of helps kind of explain some of the things that may be happening, and do it in a way that isn't misinformation. It's just matter of fact, but it gives you maybe the tools in your toolkit to kind of help you answer some of these common questions that may come up.
So skepticalscience.com, is that it?
Yeah, let me make sure. Yeah, it's skepticalscience.com. That's correct.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's open it up to questions. Here's a question for Daniel. So, you're talking about third-party ownership, doing away with the solar tax, EV infrastructure. There's some other things like if we have renewable energy standards in the state. Are those solve all those fronts at once, or is there a strategy for starting one place rather than another?
Well, you definitely can't do everything at once, as much as I'd love to be able to do that. Our strategy as an organization has always been, I kind of used the metaphor earlier about base hits. What base hits can we hit now that lead into other, better situations in the future? And so we really view, at least on the energy side, that the access issue is first and foremost. We have to be able to kind of open up the market. We have to be able to provide competition and options and choices for folks in the state. And then the second item is really trying to make sure that, once you have access, that people actually have a meaningful product that they can either buy or engage with in some way, shape, form, or fashion. So I kind of view those two things as inherently linked, but you have to solve an access problem first. I do think, though, first of all, that the transportation's issue that we brought up, like with electric transportation, that's not necessarily something that has to wait on something else, So I kind of talk about third-party ownership and fair valuation and kind of a 1-2 punch a lot, but that's not to say that we can't act now and shouldn't act now on clean transportation. And the reason that I say that is, first of all, I see there's 109 participants, so that's 109 folks, right? They can take something on, and a lot of folks can do stuff on transportation. But I think something really important for people to remember about clean transportation is that unlike a gasoline-powered or a diesel-powered vehicle, if we get more clean transportation and battery-powered vehicles out on the roads now, and we're also doing this work that I was just talking about with access and fair valuation of clean energy, those vehicles actually become cleaner over time, right? If you buy a gasoline-powered vehicle, it does not magically become cleaner 10 years from now, okay? But if we're making the progress we need to make with our electric utilities and the regulatory structure here in the state for energy, and we're putting a lot of battery-powered and plug-in vehicles on the road now, we can make those vehicles cleaner over time. So I hope that answers the question that some things are staged, some things do kind of depend on other regulatory or political or legislative action, but not everything. And oftentimes they can be done concurrently.
Seems to me that some of it is go where the energy is in your particular community, right? Where there's an opportunity, seize it, because whichever one we seize is going to have a payoff.
That's right. It's a really good point too, is depending on your frame of reference or where you're at. So for instance, if you're active on a college campus, you probably can have a lot of action on the transportation side. And maybe if you're going to be more active in a local government or with electric utility, then that you probably have more impact on the solar, the wind, the energy efficiency. So yeah, it's just where do you want to engage? Where do you feel like you have relationships to help leverage that?
Thank you. Reverend Malcom, there's a question here about the relationship between environmental justice and environmental racism, that to what degree does our work on environmental justice require and include acknowledging and reconciling long-standing environmental racism in really everywhere in the country, certainly here in Alabama?
Yeah, it doesn't. And it may sound funny, but for me, we can't delay or deny justice just because somebody doesn't admit to things that they've done. In all actuality, we all know that it's environmental racism that has caused the conditions that we have now. In fact, I would even say that environmental racism is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, because that's where most of your pollution comes from. It comes from communities of color and indigenous communities and poor white communities and rural communities. So it's often the ones, again, that are overlooked and underserved that suffer the most. And so we know this. If Nathaniel Woods was killed by Alabama a few weeks ago, or even maybe a month or so ago, executed, even though the murderer admitted that he had nothing to do with it and didn't know anything about it, yet and still, they still executed him. If you're not going to admit to that wrong, I don't expect for you to admit to any other wrong. So I can't stop. And he's not the first. It happened in Georgia as well with Troy Davis. And I'm almost certain it's happened in other places as well. I don't expect for our government to admit mistakes and admit wrong, especially now with who we have in leadership, because he never admits to anything wrong. And whatever in the head permeates through the body, so I don't expect that to happen. What I can't do is stop moving forward and stop fighting for justice and stop fighting for equity and stop fighting for peace just because somebody won't apologize. No, I'm going to take my condition and I'm going to put it in your face and perhaps even ram it down your throat until I don't care if you don't apologize, but you're going to acknowledge that it happened, even if you do it internally. But it won't stop the justice that I see.
Thank you. Karen, a lot of people are confronted with climate contrarians, and given the 5 things that you do, how would you specifically address that when it comes to the really aggressive contrarians?
Well, I think the really aggressive contrarians, they're a small percent of the population. And honestly, you're not going to, if we try to convince everybody, we're going to be spending a lot of time and energy on people that we may not want to be spending time and energy on. And really focusing on the 90% of the remaining population is really those that are maybe a little doubtful, but not full-fledged, contrarians, or maybe those that are, kind of moderate and they are somewhat open to hearing, but then if you get to those that are just skeptics, I think using the tools to find what are the common ground things that you can agree on. And that comes back to knowing your audience, is knowing what is their stance, what are the values that you agree on. And then you can go from there and say, oh, you care about your children, so do I. And I'm really concerned that this could be an issue that they're going to have to deal with because we're not, that's maybe the first step in.
Great, thank you. Daniel, we talked about Georgia. Are there other states in the South that you feel like are doing a good job getting in the right direction, and what have they done to get there?
Yeah, like I would really point to South Carolina as a state that's made a lot of progress in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. Another state that's very similar to Alabama, politically speaking, but man, have they been able to make some killer progress on clean energy. And I think this was last year that they passed a pretty wide-ranging energy freedom legislation that actually, contrary to what I just said, did a lot of the things that people have been seeking for kind of all at once. So a little bit different in a way that it happened in South Carolina because of a failed nuclear plant that caused a some utilities to go bankrupt over there that kind of created this political moment in which a lot of people were able to get a lot of really good things done. So it's a little different than Alabama per se, but I just show that as a good example of it's another state very similar to Alabama that has been working at this for quite some time. And the really cool part about South Carolina that I see that looks a lot like Alabama is that, much of what Karen was kind of just talking about, like in Alabama, we have a lot of folks, probably everybody on this call has folks in their family that are hunters, that love to go to state parks. And we, as a state, we as a people really love the outdoors. We love the beauty of this state. And in South Carolina, there's a lot of really good conservation groups. And we see that here in Alabama too, where folks are really concerned and taking care of the land and being able to enjoy that and that for a long time, right? And for future generations. And what they were able to do is really bring a lot of those groups and a lot of those people into the fold to help them understand these issues are all interlinked. They're all inextricably linked. And we have to fight for clean energy to be able to do that as well. So I would just point again to South Carolina as a really good example of kind of making that full circle movement.
Great, thank you. There's a question here that asks, has the Auburn University Board of Trustees or administration taken any steps or created a plan to take the campus to net zero through carbon offsets or renewable energy? I'll take a crack at that. Actually, in 2009, Dr. Gouge signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, joining several hundred other universities that have committed to carbon neutrality. He did that because the student body made it clear at the time that it was very important and that that's something Auburn should commit to. So we do have a climate action plan that commits us to carbon neutrality by 2050. I can tell you that the facilities, utility and energy team is working very aggressively to create as much energy efficiency as possible. They're constrained only by time and manpower to get it done. Transportation and parking, I can tell you that transportation and parking service is going to be bringing electric buses to campus. We're making the campus more alternative vehicle and transportation friendly. So there is a lot going on. The big thing, the single biggest thing we can do would be to get renewable energy. I think I've heard our calculation is that one 80 megawatt solar farm, which is the size of the one in Chambers County in Lafayette, would power Auburn University. So if we can create a purchase program that allows us to get energy at a reasonable price, then we're ready to jump on that. And that would be a fantastic step forward to be able to say that what Auburn University has done is created the equivalent of our energy use and renewable energy going to the grid. So we're working on that. We are figuring out the best steps to get there, but we will get there. Reverend Malcom, traditionally the environmental movement and the sustainability movement, climate movement, have been rightfully criticized at not being able to bridge the gap. It's largely a kind of a white middle class movement. And yet the issues, if you've so clearly pointed out, are so directly relevant to people in underserved communities, people of color. How do we bridge that gap? I know some of what Karen was saying gets us there, but we really need to make this a whole system thing. We have no justice if we don't have everyone experiencing justice. The human rights of all existing within the means of our planet.
Yeah, so it's funny, and I laugh because I'm always geared for this question because it inevitably happens. I always wind up on a panel with majority white folk, and this question always comes up as if though I'm the spokesman for Black America. And I'm gonna tell you the same thing I tell anybody else. Hell, I don't know. But seriously, in all actuality, I have I have been fighting this fight now for 3 years, and this is by far the most asked question of me. And I'll retort by saying, I don't think we speak the same language. We both fight for the same thing, but we don't speak the same language. In most Black communities, there's no struggle with climate change, there's a struggle with pollution. Most Black communities, there's no struggle with climate change, there's a struggle with food apartheid. In most communities of color, there's no struggle with climate change. There's a struggle with asthma, there's a struggle with diabetes, there's a struggle with high blood pressure, but all these are caused by the same things that you all are talking about right now. And if we could speak the same language, see, the thing is we expect for, you all oftentimes expect for Black folk to understand what you're talking about when you come and you talk about climate change and you talk about carbon dioxide and you talk about fracking and all this stuff. That's not what we pay attention to. What we're paying attention to is what's happening as a result of this. And that's where you start with us. Start with what's happening with us and then tell us why it's happening. I got into, and I'm sorry, you shouldn't have asked me, I'm a preacher.
Good, go right ahead.
I got into to this movement. I was doing a job in this movement, but I was just doing a job. It became a call and a passion for me after I heard Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley at a conference one time, and he said this: how can I preach to the people in the pulpit, shout them in my pews, but they can't breathe in public? That said something to me, because it put this whole climate thing on people. And that's where I see it at. I'm not looking at the climate from the science. I don't understand science. I'm not a scientist. I've got a master's of divinity. I've got a master's of business administration. I don't have a science background. I do understand what it's like for people to suffer at the hands of others, which is oppression. I do understand what it's like for people to suffer at the hand of others, which is bullying. I do also understand what it's like to see people ignored in their suffering, which is environmental racism. And those are the things that I deal with. Those are the things that I talk to people about. But asking them to talk about science and asking them to be involved in the climate change movement, I don't know how to get them there. I do know how to get them to come out and talk about stopping that coal mine and coal plant. I do know how to get them to come out and talk about those manufacturers that are polluting their community and extracting from their community and causing them to live in poverty. That's where I start, and that's actually where I live.
Seems to me it's really about creating relationships, interpersonal relationships from which you can build a shared understanding, but it's about the relationship. Wouldn't you agree?
Would agree that it's about the relationship, but that relationship has to start right. More than not, from what I've experienced in this movement, and even in the question, what can we do to get them involved? Help them.
It can't be transactional.
Help them.
It can't be transactional, right?
Right. It has to be relational. Help them. And not help them so they can help you. Just help them. Because if you help them, you are helping you. You help the people, you'll heal the planet.
Yeah. Karen, so much of what Reverend Malcom just said really is the practical experiential expression of what you were talking about. Do you have any thoughts to kind of follow up? Because it really resonated with me that everything you said is what Reverend Malcom just
yeah. And I think it's really interesting and important that he said, I don't have a science background, but I can relate to the people. And that's basically what he was saying. And that really goes to number one of knowing your audience, and beyond, I think even further, build relationships with your audience. If you're able to do that, that just seems like one, it's, if we go back to the Christian connection and evangelical Christianity, that's what we're called to do, is not to, this for that. I'll do this if you do that. It's go help people because they're in need, and teach them about Jesus. And you know what? Along the way, climate change could come up, because it is part of what their people are experiencing. They may not know that. They may not think about climate change as a reason they're experiencing flooding in their neighborhood, or a reason that they're experiencing, various health issues or things like that. But it's certainly, it's not the only thing, but certainly it's one of the factors. So I think if we take that viewpoint that Reverend Malcom is really bringing in to light, is this idea, it is a value-based system. And if you're an evangelical Christian, it aligns quite nicely with certainly that value system.
Thank you. Daniel, there's a question here about nuclear energy. What are your thoughts on nuclear energy as a solution in Alabama?
Oh, you're going to give me the one that's going to start the controversy, right? So I'll say that, and this is a, a rift, if you will, within many in the environmental community about the role of nuclear energy in getting to net zero by 2050, or just the future in general. And I don't know, frankly, that I have a good answer for that, because there is merit, I think, to both sides. I mean, at the end of the day, I think you're starting to see more and more advocates of all type coming around the fact that I don't think anybody, well, I don't know that anybody is really advocating for new nuclear, except for maybe in the cases of like small modular reactors and things of that nature. There's a little bit of an advocacy community around that, but most people don't advocate for the closure of existing nuclear. So the idea being is that if you already have zero carbon electricity on the grid, you definitely don't want to take it down if the replacement for that is carbon emitting electricity. This doesn't necessarily mean that has to be the case. You could take nuclear down and replace it with something that is clean, like solar plus storage, and get around that. But there's, I think, at least it seems to be, to me, more consensus around keeping existing nuclear running, trying to get the fossil fuels and frankly, the expensive gas and expensive coal off the grid as fast as possible, replace that with cheaper renewables and renewables plus storage. And then at that point, you're looking at, okay, now how do I start to take the nuclear off the grid? Because at the end of the day, the people who say, well, we need to get rid of nuclear are rightfully concerned about in large cases, or in large part concerned about nuclear waste, right? So what do I do with the waste? We still have never really figured that issue out as a country, as a society, and that has not gone away. The waste that it creates, while it's not in the air, you still have it. So there's solid waste that you have to deal with. So there really is no good answer for that problem. But yeah, I think most people come down on keeping the existing nukes running and trying to get them offline as fast as humanly possible.
My understanding, one of the big constraints to new large-scale nuclear is the cost. It's economically just not even viable without $6 billion federal guarantees and things like that. That the economics just don't make sense, even setting aside the waste issue for new large-scale solar. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, and one thing, you can look next door to Georgia and see that, they have plant Vogtle units 3 and 4 that Georgia Power is trying to build that has just been, dogged with cost overruns and project delays. And the project is now close to $30 billion. So it's going to be some of the most expensive power that anybody could buy, waste notwithstanding. And so if you look at what you could have gotten with energy efficiency, helping folks that are struggling to pay the utility bills, if you look at what you could have gotten with community solar and in those neighborhoods, or even large scale renewables and battery storage is coming in at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is substantially lower than those nuclear plants in Georgia will ever be able to generate. It really just doesn't make any economic sense to pursue new nuclear at scale in the United States.
Reverend Malcom, there's a follow-up to your comment about speaking different languages. The question is it possible that public health frame might be a bridging device in the dialogue over climate change and environmental justice and creating that common understanding and relationship?
Yes, if you put it like I did. I mean, you just, again, it's not about trying to find a scientific way of telling people they dying because they're being polluted. You tell them they dying because they're being polluted. But there's something we can do about it and ask them to help. And I guarantee you that you'll get help because they don't want to be polluted. I mean, it's a language issue. We're trying to find ways of scientific ways or even philosophical ways and of dealing with a practical issue. It's a practical issue. It's not that hard, people. It's really not. Help the people, you'll heal the planet. Everything that's happening with the climate that science has said is happening with the climate, that's man-made, oftentimes happens in communities of color. Deal with that. Deal with that. I don't think it's Alabama that needs to deal with environmental racism. I think it's Alabamians that need to reconcile environmental racism.
I know if folks want to read about a story of real success in a community, it would be the South Bronx. Google the Sustainable South Bronx Project, and Majora Carter, who started it, her first name is Majora. She tells the story of growing up there and going away to school and coming back and being especially shocked by the blight that she grew up with but had gotten used to. And it's such a polluted community that so many children there have asthma. And so she started organizing people in the community around the issue of child asthma. And to make a long story short, and if you read one of her interviews or listen to it or check out her TED Talk, she explains that out of that grew Sustainable South Bronx with a green jobs program, solar energy on rooftops, transformation educational systems, city parks, community gardens. The whole thing was transformed because she did what Reverend Malcom and Dr. McNeal said was meet people where they are, speak to the people about what matters to them sincerely, and people are smart. They're going to start making the connections. They're just going to emerge in their own thinking. So in a way, I find it actually kind of frustrating because it's an open secret what we need to do this. It's just investing the retail time, if you will. It's not really a wholesale effort. It's in time with people in their community and having the conversation and letting it emerge. Reverend Malcom?
Mike, I would even say that it is also about us having having the right focus. Marjorie's project was beautiful. And what grew out of that was even more beautiful in her concern. But her project is just one, and that's a beautiful individual effort. But to be honest with you, we need more than just an individual effort. We need system change. Mm-hmm. And that is going to take the collective hold. And that's why I try my best when I'm talking, lecturing, preaching, whatever. As long as my mouth is open and I'm in spaces like this, I'm trying my best to tell people to get busy. We are at the point where there's a sense of urgency surrounding this now. And the reality is the coronavirus, although it has delayed us in living, it speeded up everything else as far as the downfall. is concerned. And so it's added to the plight. We've got to deal with that. We've got to deal with the fact, hey man, we got to do something, and we've got to do something now.
Yeah.
Not wait on it.
Thank you. Karen, there's a question here about, there are a lot of potential allies in Alabama that would otherwise be supportive, that have been turned off by talk of climate change. It goes back to that question about where you start with people, like, for example, hunting and fishing groups and consumer groups like AERP. I mean, they're like, take the hunters and fishers, for example. I mean, if you were going to reach out to that community, how would you frame this question or this issue?
Well, I think like Daniel mentioned, you know, hunter and fishers, they care about the natural world. They care about the health of the forests that they hunt in. They care about sustainability. They care that there will be a forest for their kids that they're teaching to hunt and fish, that'll be there for them in the future years. So they care about preservation. And so preservation, sustainability, access, they care about access. These are all, and a lot of them also care about creation, and so there's a lot of shared values that I think can easily be focused on at the very beginning of a conversation. I wouldn't start with the words climate change. I wouldn't use the words Al Gore. I wouldn't talk about global warming, but, you know, not right off the bat. I would talk about, hey, you know, you really, you know, enjoy going outdoors, and you probably have seen some things. I was actually talking to my chiropractor, who is also an avid hiker on the Appalachian Trail and also does some hunting and fishing and blah, blah, blah. And he was commenting to me one day while I was in his office about how, you know, you can see the changes in nature. You know, he's very connected. He can see that there are things that are happening over his lifetime of going out to the same places and seeing different things. And so I think there's a personal story right there that can be used as, hey, what have you noticed that is different? And then how do you want it not to change in the future? Well, if you don't want it to change in the future, here are some things that we need to be doing to prevent that from happening. And I think, you know, and I never even needed to say the word climate change.
Thank you. Well, we're about 10 minutes away from our end, and so I'd like to give you each the opportunity to take a couple minutes to just sum up your main point. And if you have a key takeaway for folks, you know, remember, this is what our goal is for people in the communities of Alabama to act in their communities at the local and state level, and engage their federal legislators to the degree possible to solve climate by 2030 when it comes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. And so if you'd each take a couple of minutes to kind of summarize your thoughts and give people a key takeaway. Daniel, you want to go first?
Sure. You know, I would just echo a lot of the comments that we said, you know, throughout the day or this evening. And that's just that you got to have conversations. There's a lot of things that you can do, talking to folks, your family, your friends, folks you go to church with, folks you work with. And I think it's just about loving on folks. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, you know, what the Reverend is saying is exactly right. If you're loving your fellow man, your fellow woman, like, you're going to care about your community. We all care about our community. We all want to take care of our families. We all want to take care of everybody we love. And you should start there. And I think that in terms of, you know, specifically around energy policy and things that I, you know, kind of talked about in my portion of the presentation in terms of takeaway is that, you know, when the way that I think about the merging of those two is that we all want those things, and they're very easy, you know, from a standpoint of they can be done. These are not hard things that we're trying to do overnight. Help folks understand that they can make these changes by simply picking up the phone or a meeting with folks in their community, whether it be your city council. Like, this is a really funny story real quick that I'll tell, is just that when I've talked to a couple of city council members in different cities throughout the state, and I actually have heard this multiple times now, is that if one person calls me about an issue, they're a crazy person. If two people call me about an issue, it's a crisis, right? And so you got to think, we're all used to like, okay, take action on something that's happening in Washington, D.C. No, take action to something that's happening in your city and it's happening in your county. And it doesn't take a lot of people, your friends and family who care about this, to move the needle. And so that can happen. You can contact your legislator, your House member, your Senate member, your city council member, and you and your family can do that. And again, you're framing it, you're talking to people, to those folks around, what can we do to make our community better? Because everybody wants to do that. We have different political backgrounds or motivations for what we want out of things. But at the end of the day, we want a better community. We want a better future for our kids and the earth. So you can do that. And I think that, just pick up the phone, write the email, and don't be afraid to do that. And if you ever need help and encouragement, you call me. I'll give you my phone number, and I will step you through every single bit of it, and I will cheerlead you, and then I'll buy you a beer afterwards for making the phone call and making the email, because we can do it.
You heard it here. Thank you very much. Reverend Malcom.
Howard Thurman was a mystic and theologian that lived back in the days. And Howard Thurman's book, Jesus of the Disinherited, he talks about loving people at the level of the ashtray. And what that means is you can get down to the lowest point with them and love them back to wholeness. I think that's what's happening with some of our communities, that we oftentimes drive by and overlook to go to our nice houses and whatnot. They're living at the level of the ashtray. And the problem is, or the worst part is, they're living at this level of the ashtray, not of their own design, but it was designed for them. I've often said, and I continue to say because I live this, environmental justice is about loving your neighbor. And the way that we love our neighbors, we love them where they are. How do we do that? We start local. As I told you all, I do statewide work. I do national work, regional, national, and international work. However, when I talk to you, I didn't talk to you about international. I didn't talk to you about national. I didn't even talk to you about regional. I talked to you about the Public Service Commission. Because whether we realize it or not, it's at the local level that a lot of the power lies. A lot of the stuff that happens is happening because of the Public Service Commission's lack of inserting authority on behalf of the people that they say that they are supposed to protect and supposed to serve. Start at the local level. If you don't want to go with the Public Service Commissioner, start with your mayor, start with your city councilman. But you can help people right at the local level. We don't have to do something grandiose. We don't have to do something, ginormous. All we have to do is start locally, because that's where they're hurting. They're hurting at the level of the ashtray. Start at that level and work them up to wholeness. That would be my word.
Thank you. Karen.
I would say, like I ended my talk, let's go out and talk about it. And I think to follow that up, I would say you don't have to be perfect. There's so many conversations I've had, oh, I wish I would have done that, or I wish I've done that. But, in the end, you planted a seed and you talked about it with somebody. And whether it be your next door neighbor or your mom, your dad, your kids, your husband, your wife, whatever it is, just start with those small conversations and then see where it goes. Maybe it's the opportunity that you have around you, you may not realize. Of course, none of us are flying in airplanes right now, but I've had many an airplane conversation about various environmental and climate issues. You never know when it's going to pop up. And I think that's one additional reason to not miss the opportunity to kind of have already thought about, because you'll see more opportunities if you've already thought about it and you've already taken some steps to say, okay, what are some ways I would communicate about this? So I've given you 5 strategies. They're not the only ones out there. There's a ton of resources. I'd love to be able to tell you. If you have a question, feel free to email me, karen.mcneal@auburn.edu, and I can point you to some other resources. But, you know, talking about it is what we need to do.
Great. Well, thank you all so much, panelists. This has been outstanding. It's been a delightful 90 minutes, and it went by in a hurry. So I can't thank you enough. And I will say to anybody who's watching this, any of us would be happy to follow up with you with your questions. So please feel free to be in touch if you'd like to do that. I also want to thank you for attending this webinar and being part of the Solving Climate by 2030, which really boils down to relationships and caring for each other and doing the right thing for each other. That's my take-home message here, right? And I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Carol Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities, who co-sponsored this. And please remember that this is being recorded and it will be available for subsequent viewing on our website. Thank you all and have a very pleasant and safe evening. Bye-bye.